Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Chapter 5 of Utilitarianism, you notice that you see John Stuart Mill grappling with the notion of rights. And he talks about legal rights and moral rights. And you notice that he is spending a good bit of discussion, not just analyzing the conception of what it means to have a right, but saying that utilitarianism is going to, by its very workings, honor what we think of as rights. Now, why is he so focused on that? A little bit of backstory. His predecessor, Jeremy Bentham, the original articulator, the originator in many respects of what we call utilitarianism, understood in a quantitative sense, had said that rights were nonsense on stilts. That was the phrase that he used, and what he was talking about there were legal rights whose enforcement turned out to be bad for the community as a whole, to be bad for the aggregate of people affected. And this is still a problem today when we see legal decisions allowing certain persons or corporations or the government to do things which, when we look at it, we say that's really bad policy or that's bad decision making, because look at how it affects everybody else, the other stakeholders. So Mill wants to say utilitarianism is not going to end up trampling on people's rights, on their legitimate rights. And so how do we understand rights? It turns out there's actually a couple different correlative notions. One of these is duty, and another one is the possibility of sanctioning. And he talks about this about midway through this section. So let's start with the notion of duty. He says that when we think about what it means to have a duty, he says, it's part of the notion in every one of its forms that a person may rightfully be compelled to fulfill it. Duty is a thing which may be exacted from a person as one exacts a debt. If you have a duty to do X, then somebody should be able to tell you that you need to do it. It may not be legally enforceable. It might depend on what we call public opinion, or even, as Mill says, another possibility, the person's own conscience convicts him or her and says, you ought to be doing this. And we can think of all the different things that Mill talks about in terms of justice and injustice, like keeping promises, treating people impartially, or equal in respects in which they are in fact equal, giving people what it is that they deserve, whether good or bad, honoring, respecting rights. All of those things are possibly duties, and Mill says that you can compel a person in one way or another through some sort of sanction to do that duty. And he says, by the way, we need to distinguish this from other things. There's other things which we wish that people should do, which we like or admire them for doing, or perhaps dislike or despise them for not doing, but yet admit they're not bound to do. This is not a case of moral obligation. That is not a duty in any sort of strict sense, he says. So, I do have to feed and clothe my children, and I should, in fact, look out for their welfare in other respects, but do I actually have to show up at my kids' recitals, because they invite me? Mill would say, no, there isn't actually a duty to do that. We're not going to call upon the law to enforce that. Maybe your conscience will bother you a bit, but perhaps there's good reasons why you don't make it to the concert or the recital, right? Whereas, if your kid is going without shoes or medicine or not going to school, there's a real problem there. There's some sort of duty. And duties have to do with not doing harm in some way. Injustice has to do, for Mill, with harm. So he goes on and he tells us about this. When we say that a person has a right, he says there are duties of perfect obligation, duties in virtue of which a correlative right resides in some person or persons, right? So, for example, if I have children, the state says that I need to educate them. Now, it doesn't tell me exactly how I need to educate them, but it does say that they need to be educated in some way. They could go to private school, public school, maybe homeschooled. There could be all sorts of different possibilities. But I do have to educate them. And if I don't do that, I am violating their rights, the right to an education. There's all sorts of other possible examples. He talks about, depriving a person of a possession, breaking faith with them, treating them worse than they deserve, or worse than other people who have no greater claims. He says, in each case, the supposition implies two things: a wrong, an injustice that is done, some assignable person who is wronged. Injustice may, he says, also be done by treating a person better than others, but the wrong is done in this case to his competitors, who are also persons who have rights. So he goes on and he says that when we think about the notion of a right residing in the injured person, what does that mean? He says that it's not I've treated this not as a separate element in the composition of the idea and sentiment, but as one of the forms in which these clothe each other. The elements are a hurt to some assignable person and a demand for punishment. Society, if we say that somebody has a right, we're saying that society ought to enforce that right. Society ought to punish or sanction in some way the other person who has a duty to respect that right. Now, this could be, very singular. I mentioned that my children have a right to education, but somebody else's kid down the block who has a right to education, it's not really my duty to provide them an education, is it? It's my duty to provide my children with an education. And if the neighbor, if their kid isn't going to school, it's not like the social workers or child protective services are going to come knocking on my door to sanction me. They're going to sanction that guy down there. There are some things where we have very, very general rights, right? None of us have the right to poison the water supply that all of us drink from. None of us have the right to light a fire in a crowded theater or to yell fire when there is no fire in a crowded theater either, as it turns out. So there's all sorts of things where, it may be that a whole bunch of people have that duty, or it may be that only one person has that duty, but society ought to enforce that person's right. That's what it means to actually have a right. If I have a right to freedom, that means that if you try to kidnap me, somebody should step in, whether it be the police or whether it be public sentiment or whether it be your own conscience, which probably won't be all that effective if you are in fact kidnapping me. Somebody ought to be stepping in. So Mill says that the idea of the right includes a demand for punishment. He says these two things are what we mean when we speak of violation of a right. We call anything a person's right. We mean that he has a valid claim on society to protect him in the possession of it, either by the force of law or that by that of education and opinion. If he has what we consider a sufficient claim to have something guaranteed to him by society, we say he has a right to it. If we desire to prove that anything does not belong to him by right, we think this done as soon as it's admitted that society doesn't have to take measures for securing it to him, but that he should provide it by his own exertion. So to use Mill's previous example, I do have a right, for example, to enter into economic competition with other people and thereby to earn my living. I do not have a right to an automatic $100,000 a year. There's no, society ought to provide that to me, agreed upon by everybody. There are some people who think that everybody should get, a lot of money or something like that, but that's not agreed upon by the totality of society. So what is the upshot of this for utilitarianism? Utilitarianism, when it's working well, is going to respect rights, and it's going to be involved in sanctioning well these people who have duties to make sure they're not violating other people's rights. Notice, too, this is the last thing I want to say, that everybody not only is over here, but also over here. We have obligations towards each other by living in society. Not only are you not supposed to kill or defraud or slander me, but I'm not supposed to do that to you either. So we all have duties. There are correlative rights that correspond to those duties. There is a capacity for society to sanction us in this. This is the way that utilitarians of Mill's stripe do look at rights, so that they're not simply, as Bentham said, nonsense on stilts.